lost in the weeds. The problem with Hassan, the problem that we have still to this day, is that there's no common sense. It's, as an example, and this will I'm sure piss people off to talk about, is the idea of profiling. Well, good God, we know where the threat currently comes from, right? We know what the threat currently looks like for the most part, right? So profile. You know, you want to resolve our problems and have more security at the airports, you know, and resume sort of a normal pace of life, well, let's profile. And then at the point when then the threat becomes Norwegians, let's profile for Norwegians, right? But we can't do that because we've gone so far over the edge on this politically correct, you know, sensitivity towards Islam that we've become unable to discuss the thing in a logical fashion.
It is an issue of common sense. I mean, Buck, you asked the question, how do we deal with this issue? Well, first we have to name it. And no one is willing to name it. When Peter King has to go out at a hearing and say 17 times, we're not talking about all Muslims. Well, no kidding, we're not talking about. But that's how fearful and paranoid we have all become about actually addressing this problem. The night of Fort Hood, I was going on TV, and a producer at an unnamed network brought me backstage and said, let's not talk about the Islam thing. Let's call him a disgruntled employee. That's injecting a narrative into this story that does not exist.
The federal government claimed that this was workplace violence.
Exactly. And this was after we knew what had been said and what had happened and who he was and what he was after. Right. So the first problem is we will not even name it. We're scrubbing documents of words like Islam and extremism. This is our big
Mike, at the time,
enemy right now.
Right. At the time of the Fort Hood shooting, I had, you know, in-depth and multiple conversations with a friend who's a lieutenant commander in the Navy, a fighter pilot, and I asked him about this. We see that Nidal Hassan gave a slideshow to his colleagues, basically celebrating jihad. And the guy was supposed to be a shrink. Right. Then in the media, we heard this invention of pre-traumatic stress syndrome because he actually had never even served in combat yet, but he was supposed to be under all this tremendous pressure. And my friend, the lieutenant commander, said, look, it's also the military culture. He pointed all the way back to tailhook. And he said, if you were to point out to your superiors that, you know, this guy seems a little shady, there's something going on with him, talk about jihad all the time, that would be a career ender. Right. You could forget it.
That's, you know, there's something to that. There's something about reporting up the chain of command on a variety of things. But there were signals, and they've reviewed this ad nauseum. There were signals that were missed, and they were missed. I don't know how anybody could argue otherwise, because people were afraid to call it what it was,
right.
Which was, and as you had pointed out. So, will we get past that? I doubt it. I spent 19 hours in traveling around airports yesterday, just trying to make one meeting, and I canceled flights, and so I had a lot of time to stand around in security lines. And not to go back to the same thing, but I view this as part of it, and it's also part of, every kid gets a trophy. We've washed out our society, right?
We need to achieve a level of fair-minded vigilance with this, too. I mean, look, U.S. military, 1.5 million, roughly, active duty personnel. And if you believe the NPR report, the government's not commenting on it specifically, if you believe the NPR report, you're looking at a dozen active investigations. So this is a tiny problem.
And that's very important to point out.
Yeah. We need to understand how to make sure that if those dozen cases are real, how they're dealt with so they don't become a Nidal Hassan situation.
We have to stop we need to stop defining ourselves by terrorism, by the war on terror. We've gone through this. It's been over a decade. The threat still exists out there, but at this point, you'd like to think we were more mature in how we deal with it, how we process it, how we approach it than we were, say, 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. But we still continue occasionally to have this thing where we're just defined by terrorism and by the war on terror, and we haven't grown up within this problem and learned how to process it efficiently. So when you have a story like this, it becomes blown out of proportion to some degree. I'm not saying that this is an important issue.
It's a real threat
the lone wolf
in context.
Right. But it's always a context. The lone wolf threat or the homegrown threat is always been present. It's always been a problem. And now it just happens to be extremism. And yet we can't talk about it.
You'd hope that the procedures just reflect the military is not a social club, right? I mean, it's the critical thing for U.S. national security, and so hurt feelings should play a very, very, very distant second to force protection and the mission.
But unfortunately, apparently, there's a lot of fear in the military that it would be worse to be seen as a bigot and perhaps, flag someone for behavior that is certainly questionable than to see what happens, the consequences play out.
Praising suicide bombers, you would think, would go way beyond.
That should be a trigger.
Wasn't reported, unfortunately.
So let's focus in on this story, this NPR report, and accept its validity for now, and then do what you said, Mike. Let's put it into context. 13 possible homegrown terrorists within the United States military. Putting that in context, and I'm not familiar, please correct me where I'm wrong, that seems like a lot to me when I put it into the context of how many homegrown terrorists have we actually had over the last decade. I can't name 13 incidences from the civilian population, so why would we be having these, pick whatever adjective you like, prevalent, disproportionate, concerning number of homegrown terrorists within the military?
There have been a lot more.
Population. Yeah, but anyway.
But you don't know the parameters of what constitutes a serious investigation, frankly.
Right.
And it's informed in part by the Fort Hood shooting. And now, of course, anytime you have an incident like that, and then there's after-action reports, and then there's a tendency to cover your ass, right? And hopefully I can say that here on the show.
You can.
Good. We said it.
We are live.
Yeah.
Don't worry, Mike.
Okay.
I took that heat off you tonight.
Thank you, Will.
About the numbers, actually, some of the more well-known cases up in Buffalo, with the Lackawanna 6, and I believe there was like the Montreal 9 and the Raleigh 7. So it tends to be clusters, which is what they call it, sort of more loosely affiliated than a cell, which is operational, of individuals. So they're in batches, actually. And every year, until actually this year, really, there's been at least one or two of these batches in the civilian population.
But to Will's point,